Welcome to Music Local and Sustainable, the radio show that features discussions with and the music of local musicians. I am your host, Dave Lake. Tonight on Savannah Music Local and Sustainable, I'm talking with local pianist Aaron Larian about his life in music and the new album released just this last month entitled A Joyous Opus. Welcome to Savannah Music Local and Sustainable, Aaron Larian.
Hi, it's so great to be here.
So tell me a little bit about your musical journey.
It began when I was 5 years old. I started taking piano lessons from my grandmother, classical piano lessons. And that continued until I was maybe 11 or 12, and I switched to another local classical teacher. But pretty early on, I got into jazz. I remember my brother would listen to Incognito, the vocal group, and pretty early on, he was listening to Chick Corea. And I kind of latched onto that too. I remember the acoustic band album. I really enjoyed that pretty early on. Just started listening to jazz, and at some point I took improvisation lessons from a pianist that was in my church, and that kind of opened my eyes that you can play not just what's on the page. You can deviate and add things, and it kind of from there I just joined the local jazz there was a group at Ruth Eggert Hall that did jazz education for middle school and high school. So I joined that, did the school jazz bands in middle school and high school, and then I went to UNF, majored in jazz studies, and now I'm here.
So you got into jazz quite early.
Yeah. My family has always been very musical, so they'd play classical music, they'd play jazz, and, kind of everything. And I guess for whatever reason, I really enjoyed it early on.
But your initial piano training was classical.
Yes. And I still practice classically, and if you listen to the album, it's very much incorporated into my music still.
And at a recent concert, you did a little Mozart.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I try to keep the repertoire up in my fingers as much as I can.
And so you grew up in Florida?
Yes, Seminole, Florida. And then I moved to Jacksonville. That's where UNF is, and then I came here.
Yeah, University of North Florida.
Yes.
And they have a very prominent jazz program.
They do. Yeah. Bunky Green used to teach there. He still lives in Jacksonville. We just did I think it was his 90th birthday concert, it was really cool to see him.
And so when you go to a undergraduate program in jazz, tell me about what you study.
Well, there's a lot of fundamentals that you need to learn as a jazz pianist. They're called voicings, which is, if you have a chord, you have to play certain notes that make up that chord, and the way you do it is called the voicing. So you learn kind of the standard way to do that, and that's a lot of work. You learn scales, different permutations of scales that go with different chords, and you take composition classes, jazz history, you do ensembles, small group. I did big band, kind of a little bit of everything, really.
And the way you approach music is very different than the way you approach music in the quote-unquote classical realm, where you read the music off the page.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, with jazz, there are no rules, really, and you're almost trying to poke the bear. You're trying to just have fun with it, and you're trying to inspire the other bandmates to be creative, and then they inspire you to be creative, and it's sort of this collective effort of creativity.
And again, in piano, you have to know your theory, you have to know keys and things like that, but you're not asked to supplement a performer in a particular key, or change the key if the performer wishes to change the key, as you have to do in the jazz area.
Sure. And usually you'd want some of that to be planned out beforehand, but sometimes it's not. And you need to be able to adapt, and you have to be fluent in every key, and it needs to be not a problem to do that, because you're there to support the singer or the instrumentalist that you're performing with.
And for instance, at a recent concert I saw you at, the singer asked to sing it a little higher. How did you respond to that request?
I I did what she said. And usually you'd want the singer to tell you the correct key beforehand, but that's not always the case.
And so you had to change to a slightly higher key?
Yeah, I think we raised it up a few steps.
As a pianist, you're often the support for the performer. On the album we're going to be talking about, you're the lead, but
Right.
but often the job of the pianist is to support the other performer. And so you talk about the key that they want to deal with in advance so that you get a good idea of that. But that varies from song to song.
Sure. And I think the most important thing as a supporter is just to use your ears and listen. Because whoever's leading you, you want to follow whatever direction they're going in, and you want them to feel comfortable. You don't want to get in the way, but you also don't want to be too passive. You want to kind of assert yourself a little bit, but you want to support them.
Now, how often are you given music as a classical musician would be given music, and how often is it just charts, and how often is it just, oh, we're going to play this tune?
It's kind of a little of everything. So I work with the Equinox Orchestra. It's a local band here. And for most of that, we get charts. And the charts, sometimes it will have everything written out, but preferably it will be, they're called like lead sheets, or they'll have just, they have slashes and they have the chords that you're supposed to play. So it's kind of giving you a little guidance, but you still have creative control over what you're exactly playing. But obviously with classical, it's always, everything is exactly what is on the page.
And so when you're playing with the Equinox Orchestra, everything is charted.
Pretty much. I mean, every now and then we'll do an audible, and they'll call, Georgia or something like that we just know. But usually it's charts. Yep.
And you'll actually be playing here in Savannah with the Equinox Orchestra. They have several events coming up in the near future.
So, yeah. I'd have to look at my calendar to know for sure.
And so when you're part of a band like that, how much of what you do is related to the band, and how much of what you do is related to other things?
A lot of what I do is with Equinox nowadays. I mean, we travel a lot. We just came back from a tour in Iowa, Illinois. We were in Nashville, and then Arkansas and a few other states. So it definitely takes up a lot of my time. But pretty much my other thing that I do usually is I play solo piano at the JW Marriott here in Savannah downtown. And that's every weekday from 5 to 8. So that takes, most of my remaining time.
And where in the Marriott do you play?
It's right in the lobby. When you walk in, there'll be a big chrome dinosaur. And look down a little bit, and then you'll see me.
Under the dinosaur.
That's right. Yep.
So look for the dinosaur. So when you're performing there, what sort of things do you play?
They kind of let me play whatever I want, which I'm very grateful for. So I'll play jazz standards, and sometimes I'll play classical. Sometimes I'll just work on sight reading some stuff, and I'll work on playing tunes in different keys than what I'm used to, and a little of everything, really.
So that can be used to develop your skills, too.
That's right, yeah. Sure, and I see any performance as somewhat of a practice session, too. You're trying to hone your skills every time you play.
Now, one of the other major things you're involved with is the American Traditions Vocal Collection, in terms of the competitions, as well as in terms of some of the performances that they do around town.
Sure, yeah.
But what you've done is schedule a considerable amount of time. The third week in February, I think it is, February 19th through the 23rd, is the American Traditions Competition. And you'll be playing for that.
That's right. Looking forward to it.
And so that is a very challenging activity.
Yes, it is.
Because you've got to prepare a lot of songs.
Yes. So we have, I think, 9 contestants each, or 10 each, and then we have 9 songs per contestant. So do the math. It's 90 songs to learn before the competition.
You perform then as a collaborative pianist with each vocalist. And do you have a chance to talk to the vocalists before they come?
We do. Sometimes we'll FaceTime or Zoom call them, and that's really up to the vocalist to kind of initiate that. And sometimes they have more of an idea of what they want. Sometimes they have no idea, and that's a little more challenging. But we can talk a little bit beforehand to kind of figure out what we're going to do when we actually meet in person.
And then you get a chance to meet with them before the competition.
Yes. So we have a little bit of a practice session, but it's, I think, 15 minutes per contestant. So it's just enough to really run through it and talk about it a little bit, but it's not much.
And so what sort of things do you talk about in 15 minutes?
I mean, with that short amount of time, it's more just logistic type things. They want to take more time at this section, or, maybe we weren't quite together somewhere. So we're just kind of trying to line everything up.
So you run through the song with them, and then you sort of chat about it at that point.
Sure, yeah. Or, maybe just run through it again if it was fine, or it's not enough time to really develop together as an ensemble that much. So it's more of a logistic practice.
And the other thing about the American Traditions competition is that it is a very varied in genre.
Yes, it is. There's classical performances, jazz, pop, even some rock, kind of a little bit of everything.
Yeah, they have like 19 categories or 20 categories, and they have to choose a song from 9 different categories.
Oh, okay. I actually didn't know that.
Yeah. So they're required to be very versatile in terms of their performances, too.
Yeah.
And then you work with these performers as they go through the competition.
That's right. So we have the first round, and it weeds out, I think, half of them. And it's sort of funny because there's 3 pianists that do the accompanying for this competition. And it's sort of the luck of the draw. At the next round, I might have 1 contestant that made it, or I might have, all 10 of them made it. So it can be very stressful or very relaxed, depending on your luck.
Or their luck, I guess.
Yeah, their luck, I guess, yeah.
And this will be the second year you've done this?
Yes. Yep, last year was my first year.
So you have a little bit of experience in terms of adapting to...
Sure, yeah. But I've also done this sort of thing really since middle school. We did, I don't know if it's in Georgia too, the solo and ensemble, sort of where the kids go out and they perform a piece and they get a rating from a judge. And I would accompany basically all my classmates in middle school, and they'd pay me. And I even made little contracts that their parents had to sign because they wouldn't pay me, and I'd have to go after them for their money.
And so you've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, so yeah, I've been accompanying different either instrumentalists or vocalists for quite a long time now.
Now, in the American Traditions competition in February, if they get to the finals, they actually have a jazz combo that they play with at the finals. But you would be the pianist in that combo?
Yes. So it's me, and then there'd be a bass player and a drum player.
And did you have anybody make the finals last year?
1 or 2 that made it. I had a lot in this semifinal round, and then I think I had maybe just 1 that made it to the finals.
So let's switch gears and talk about your album.
Sure.
Now, the album, again, is A Joyous Opus, and that's the first number on the album. Why the name of the song and why the name of the album?
Well, I wanted to sort of give the implication that this is a jazz album, but it very much is inspired by classical music. So, the word opus kind of implies that it's a classical work. And then joyous is because it's sort of, the whole album is not joyous the whole time, but it has kind of the whole range of human emotion. And I wanted to show that it wasn't just playing pieces, like a lot of times jazz musicians will just play standards and improvise and be done. But that's not what this is. This is an exploration of emotions and feelings.
And it draws from a wide variety of different sources. And going through, I was sort of listening. Of course, it's a jazz album, quote unquote. That's how it's listed.
Right.
In the various streaming services. It is a jazz album, but it has classical influences. And the thing that struck me is show tunes. Right off the bat, let's take Joyous Opus right off the bat. It starts off with this bass opening, and then you go into this joyous piano melody. But the melody sort of there, and there's variations on the melody comes back. It's almost like a show tune medley.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm very much inspired by classical pieces that take a motive and transform it and develop on it. And I think most of the tunes on this album do that to some degree. So I just like, having a central idea that's kind of permeates the song, and then you explore that in different ways.
And this is truly a joyous feeling. It's properly named.
Thank you.
And the second cut on the album, Time's Knocking at the Door, this has a really driving left-hand ostinato.
Yes,
that you set up, and then you have the melody, of course, in the right hand. But Time's Knocking at the Door, this time is insistent. This is not a relaxed time. This is a very driven time, because that left-hand ostinato really drives throughout the entire piece.
Yes, and that was very intentional because, if you look at the title, it really is meant to capture that feeling of time is always there. You only have so much of it, and it's always in the back of your mind. How much time do you have left? So it's like it's knocking at the door. And that was a fun challenge, too, to play, because even when I'm soloing, I'm keeping that left-hand ostinato going, and it's pretty challenging to do that. So it was really fun to work that up.
And this one also features the drums, is quite prominent in this particular piece.
Yes.
And who are the two musicians with you on the album?
So the drummer is Stefan Klein, and the bass player is Dan Piper.
And how do you know these players?
Stefan I went to school with at the University of North Florida. I think he was 1 year ahead of me. And then Stan, he's in the Equinox Orchestra, as is Stefan. They're both in the Equinox Orchestra with me. So I've played together with them a lot, and that's kind of why we have a real tight connection as a trio.
The next tune, Echoes of a Portrait. And this has a wonderful extended bass solo.
Yes, it does. Stan is very melodic, and he also knows how to take a motive and develop it, and that's one of the reasons that he's on the album, and he does a beautiful job with this one.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about bass players. Was his solo charted, or was that pretty much him?
All the solos are completely improvised.
Because he uses the motive a lot.
Yes.
Is that his tendency, or is that your instruction?
Probably a little of both, but it's definitely his tendency, and that's why I had him on the album.
That's something I particularly like in a bass player, not to just go off someplace
Yes.
and get into their own head, but to sort of tie into the tune that they're soloing in.
Sure, and I think that goes for any musician, really. When you're improvising, you should at least have an idea of the melody and the meaning of the tune. You're not just playing all the scales that you know and all the arpeggios,
And then Joy Takes Flight gets us back into that joyous mood. What was the origin of this tune?
This one is definitely inspired by sort of Asian music, Asian culture. My girlfriend is Taiwanese, and I actually got to visit Taiwan earlier this year in January during the Lunar New Year, which is a crazy time to go to Taiwan. But the melody of this one is very pentatonic, the scale that permeates a lot of Asian music. So that was sort of the impetus for this one, as well as my pet bird, Sesame. I have a cockatiel. And this one, I think, really captures that feeling of flight. And flight is also something I've always been inspired by. I do like RC airplanes, and I've always wanted to take flying lessons. And so it's sort of a mixture of a few different things that inspired this one.
The next tune on the album is Whispers of a Sleepless Night. And this is the strong classical one, I think, on the album, because I sort of hear echoes of maybe 20th century, 21st century composers. I don't hear Mozart, I don't hear Beethoven.
Sure.
But I hear sort of a little George Crumb, maybe.
Yeah.
A little Morton Feldman, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my brother, even when he heard it, he said Debussy, which I could hear a little bit of. But this one, it was interesting recording it because we did a few takes of it, and it sounded okay. It was good. But then Stefan actually suggested to do one more take and this time play as little as you possibly can. And what came out, I think, was beautiful. It's just so sparse and so hauntingly beautiful.
Yes, particularly the opening and the closing.
Yes.
That's where I get the Morton Feldman and the George Crumb.
Sure.
Because they write very sparsely for the piano. Morton Feldman writes in a very long form, but it's the sparseness, I think, that sort of was the element. Particularly again at the beginning of the ending. And also the harmonies take in pretty much the whole keyboard.
So the way I composed this actually is I took the melody, which is on its own not really too complicated. It's pretty singable, I think. And then I just figured out all these different harmonies that would fit underneath that. And then each time I play through the melody, I would change the harmony a little bit. And I think it really worked. I actually, first, the name of this was Discordance, because it was sort of like a pretty melody that didn't fit with the harmony underneath it. And that was sort of the idea behind this. And then I changed the title, which I think works better. But that's how I composed the piece.
Well, yeah, and you hear that sort of tension between the melody and the harmonies.
Yes, absolutely. And I love the juxtaposition of this one right after Joy Takes Flight, because it's just such a stark contrast, in terms of emotions.
Yeah, we've been more in the joy up until this point.
That's right, yeah.
And this one sort of takes us into a whole different sonic sphere. Both melodically and harmonically takes us into a very different sphere, as well as the fact that it's the intro and outro particularly are quite sparse in terms of that sensibility. Even the melody is very sparse because it's not concentrated within the same octave. It's
sure.
not. It's sort of over different parts of the keyboard in terms of that sensibility that you get from the piece. And it has these interesting conflicts between the melody and the harmonies, these dissonances. And as I was listening through, because of the sparseness, the dissonances aren't overwhelming. They're almost like blues notes.
Sure, yeah.
The next piece on the album really is very short, but it is the perfect title for the piece because when I was listening to it, I just had this sense of swirling. So I looked at it, and so it's called Dance of the Tempest. Oh, the perfect name, because I get this sort of swirling, rotary feeling of the music, like a tornado coming through.
Absolutely. And so this one was actually inspired by sort of addiction problems that are passed down, and I had my own journey with that, and this one is sort of capturing that feeling of when you're going down that spiral.
Because it's intense. Where the first cuts on the album were joyous, clearly joyous. Mm-hmm. This one, and then Whispers of a Sleepless Night, was very introspective, very different sonic environment. Dance of the Tempest sort of returns us to that original environment of activity, but it's not the joyous activity that we heard in the previous tunes.
Sure.
But it's very active.
Yes. It's almost more like, a bowl in a china shop. Like you said, it's swirling, just destruction, and it's quite different from all the other tracks.
And the next piece also, I immediately thought classical. The next piece is Prayer's March. Particularly the intro and the outro. The middle goes a little bit differently, but particularly the intro and the outro, it sort of is like a marche grave. When I was listening to it, the immediate thing that came to mind actually was Berlioz and the March to the Scaffold.
Oh, yeah.
From a Symphonie Fantastique.
Yes.
That's what I had in mind. What did you have in mind?
Well, it's the picture that I had in my mind is, walking up the long stairway up to some temple or something. And that's sort of the picture that came to mind with this one.
And again, it is so different in its sonic environment, but it's not Whispers of a Sleepless Night. Whispers of a Sleepless Night is remote. It is disconnected. It is sparse. This one is very driven, but it's driven in a very, very different way than the rest of the tunes on the album.
Yeah, this one to me feels more firm and grounded than something like Whispers. And of course, this one coming after Dance of the Tempest, it's sort of the aftermath of that. It's like this huge storm came through, and now you're healing and you're coming out of that, and that's, you know, why it's prayer's march.
The next tune, I call it Iroha. I think of either the Japanese poetry or the anime that is associated often with that word. What was in your mind?
So this one actually does have a specific story that you wouldn't know unless I told you. And you nailed it with the Japanese poetry. That's where the title comes from. So I actually wrote this song as a gift to my girlfriend. And the connection there is that my girlfriend does graphic design. And graphic design, you'd work with fonts, and you have a sentence that has all the characters in the alphabet. In English, the sentence is a brown fox jumped over the lazy dog or something like that. And then in Japanese, they have a similar type of sentence that contains all the characters, and it's Iroha. That's where that comes from. So it was a gift to my girlfriend.
And this is another one with a really wonderful extended bass solo.
Yes, he does such a good job with this one.
The melodic line in this case is really sort of singing, where in some of the earlier pieces, the melodic line seems to be rushed. In this one, it's really sort of relaxed and singing.
Yes. And that's, if I'm singing a love song to my girlfriend, it needs to be happy and joyful and singing, not rushed and frantic.
And the next tune on the album is Why Do the Stars Fade? And this to me was wistful, thoughtful, pondering. It is in the form of a question, yes, but I didn't think of it as much as questioning as sort of pondering reality, pondering life. And again, particularly the opening and the ending. And this has a really great percussion throughout the piece, too.
Yeah, Stefan did a great job with this one. But yeah, the title actually comes from, I have all the exotic pets. I have rats as pets, too. One of them was named Vincent after Vincent van Gogh, and he passed away, and that's when I wrote this tune. So that's why it's Why Do the Stars Fade, because that's a reference to Vincent van Gogh. But the tune is really about thinking about reality, thinking about your existence, sort of an existential thought. So it's why do things live and why do they pass away? That's what this tune is about.
Why the choice of the emphasis on percussion in this particular piece?
I think that's just how Stefan interpreted it, because if you think about the meaning, if it's about why do things pass away, sort of when that crescendos, there's all the stages of grief. And then part of that is anger, and you're yelling to the world, why does this happen? So I think that's sort of the role that he plays in this one.
And the last piece on the album is Words Forgotten. And this piece is, to me, the perfect culmination of the album because of the fact that everybody's involved. I mean, you hear very strong elements from the bass. You hear very strong elements from the drums. Particularly in this case, the ostinato seems to be a snare ostinato.
Mm-hmm. The snare and also the piano figure kind of permeates it, too.
With each other, yeah.
Yeah. This one, I've been told it kind of sounds like you're driving on the road and just moving along. And I think this one is sort of a goodbye for now, but to be continued. It sort of invites you to listen to the next album, which I'm looking forward to doing.
And so this seems to be a very personal album. A lot of the elements come from things in your life.
Yes, it's deeply personal, very emotional, yes.
Is there any overall sort of things that you'd want the listener to think about when they're listening to this album? Or
I do wish everyone could read the liner notes, which unfortunately, if you're streaming it, you don't get any of that. But you can always go to the website or go to my Instagram and it's all there. But I think it's cool to listen to it blind, maybe first. But then if you read the meaning behind it, I think it adds even more to the songs.
And so you're anticipating another album?
I'd love to do another one, yeah.
What goes into making an album?
A lot of time and money. I mean, you have to pay the musicians, you have to book the studio, You have to get it mixed and mastered. I had a publicist that we went 3 months. We sent out emails and sent out CDs all over the country. And then, of course, social media promotion and all that stuff. Design work, you have to design the cover and the whole physical CD if you're doing that. Yeah, there's a lot of steps involved that are not music. But, of course, first you have to write the songs. What I did, I sort of had ideas for each of them, but they weren't fully fleshed out yet. And then I booked the studio date. And that kind of forced me to get them all done and get everything together. So that could be helpful to have some sort of deadline that you're working towards.
And so rather than having all the songs charted out, they were sort of more ideas when you were starting to think about this album.
At first, yeah, most of them, it was like the opening motif, which you could probably tell listening to them. That's really a lot of the strong ideas come from those initial motifs, and then it develops from there. So, I had the first maybe couple of bars in my head, and then I kind of fleshed it out from there.
And as we were talking about Whispers of a Sleepless Night, this sounded like a lot of that came in the studio in terms of the final form that we hear on the album.
Sure, and that's another reason that I love working with Stan and Stefan, is because they're both monster musicians as well. So I would ask them, what do you think about this? And it's more of a collaboration, I think. I am the leader of the album, but we really worked as a team to get the best music out of this.
So, in retrospect, would you have done anything differently on the album?
I don't think so. I'm very happy with it, and listening to it, I just get so much enjoyment still. Even though I've listened to it hundreds of times now, I still enjoy listening to the album.
Yeah, it's the enthusiasm that comes throughout the album is irrepressible. So, tonight on Savannah Music Local and Sustainable, I've been talking with local pianist Aaron Larian about his life in music and his new album released just this past month, A Joyous Opus. And I want to thank you, Aaron, so very much for being on the show tonight.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.